getting in the ambulance, getting to the hospital. Luckily, I had a great surgeon, and I had so much pain medication at that point. I was kind of out of it.
Simon Cowell is remembered as the ruthless judge who turned unknown singers into stars. But at 65, his story is not about power. It's about pain. Behind the cameras and the empire lie scars of neglect, crushing failures, scandals, devastating losses, and near-fatal accidents. Age has made his fragility impossible to ignore. We'll explore how the man who once commanded global television now faces a different fight, one against time, loneliness, and tragedy, revealing the vulnerable reality behind his legend. A childhood starved of affection. Before Simon Cowell became the sharp-tongued mogul who commanded stages and silenced contestants with a single raised eyebrow, he was a boy haunted by absence. Not the absence of food, shelter, or opportunity, but something more invisible: the absence of affection. His childhood was not marked by dazzling spotlights, but by the cold shadow of emotional distance that shaped him in ways no one could have predicted. Born in October 1959 in Lambeth, London, Simon entered a family that, on the surface, seemed privileged and secure. His mother, Julie Brett, was a ballet dancer and a socialite, gliding through life with poise. His father, Eric Selig Philip Cowell, was a music industry executive and property developer, a man whose work connected him to the glittering worlds of entertainment and wealth. To outsiders, the Cowells were the kind of family others admired. But inside the home, young Simon often felt like a ghost, living among polished walls. His father, despite his ties to the world of music, was not the nurturing type. He measured success in achievement, discipline, and results, not in words of comfort. Simon would later admit, with raw honesty, that throughout his childhood, "My father never said, 'I'm proud of you,' even when I needed it most." That missing phrase, so small yet so powerful, became a wound that never closed. For a boy desperate for recognition, silence was more brutal than criticism. Simon's mother, Julie, fitted both categories. She had elegance, but also aloofness. Her interests veered toward performances and appearances. She would be present, but emotionally, she would float at arm's-length distance. Simon often felt that his needs, struggles, and presence were sidelined in a home that venerated image over intimacy. Such subtle neglect engendered a quiet craving in him, craving for not food, but for recognition, acknowledgement, and the warmth of being attended to. There was no way to find solace in the school. At Radlett Preparatory School, and later Dover College, Simon was a far cry from the child prodigy whom his parents would have preferred to see. He was not the brilliant scholar who dazzled everyone with his studies, nor was he the super athlete winning stars and chants on the field. Instead, at the back of the room was that restless boy who clashed with authority, broke rules, and tested the very limits. While his peers were registered in people's memories, even Simon went relatively unnoticed. He trudged off with, at best, a GCE in English and sociology without pride, but under the crushing weight of disappointment. In a family where excellence was currency, Simon felt entirely bankrupt. The sound of rejection was the whisper of an unseen, comforting presence in Simon's life. It became a constant companion. "You are not enough." By the late teens, this voice had become a hard verdict. His father got him a mailroom position at EMI Music, perhaps more out of pity than pride, carrying coffees to producers and sorting fan mail for stars of the size to fill arenas, while his name remained unsung. Simon would say later, "I was invisible in a world obsessed with the spotlight." The words bore the pain of someone who knew what it meant to exist unnoticed. The boy starved of affection would become the man who demanded the world's attention. The collapse of Fanfare Records. If Simon Cowell's childhood had been a lesson in invisibility, his early career was a masterclass in humiliation. The boy who once carried coffee cups through EMIT's mailroom was determined to rise, not through brilliance or luck, but through sheer defiance of rejection. By the early 1980s, Simon had clawed his way into the fringes of the music business, daring to gamble everything on a dream of independence. With a partner, he launched his own label, Fanfare Records. At first, it looked like the gamble had worked. The label found success with the glittery pop single So Macho by Sinita, a track that became a surprise hit across the UK. For the first time, Simon tasted the intoxicating sparkle of recognition. He was no longer the boy hidden in the background. He was the man hosting parties, clinking glasses, and shaking hands with people who once ignored him. For a fleeting moment, it seemed he had escaped the invisibility that haunted his youth. But the entertainment industry is merciless, and success in music is as fragile as the paper contracts it's written on. Trends shifted. Pop tastes have evolved. And the empire Simon thought he was building collapsed with brutal speed. Fanfare, which had promised to be his escape from obscurity, became a crumbling shell of broken deals and worthless contracts. What had begun with champagne toasts ended in silence. By the end of the 1990s, Simon's company was bankrupt. The very dream he had pursued so fiercely was in ashes. He was barely in his early 30s, but already carrying debts so heavy that they seemed never to be paid off. The vultures, that is, the creditors, were circling above his head. Friends who had once filled his parties had melted away. Doors were closed upon him, whispers of his poor reputation trailed behind him, and Simon Cowell, the once poor kid who had hardly known any affection and appreciation, stripped of all that dignity too. It was not merely financial, but the fall was an act of vengeance. Without his company, Simon had to move back in with his parents, to the very same child's bedroom in which he had learned to be lonely. Picture the humiliation. The boy who had dreamt of being seen, who had finally made it out, now stuck in the very room where his heart was dealt its first blow by invisibility. Years on, he would confess that this was almost the end of him, and he added that he did feel like a ghost haunting his own life. For most individuals, this would indeed have been the end of life for them. It would have included a failed business, a disgraced name, and a royal retreat into obscurity. But Simon Cowell was not most people. What looked like an insurmountable defeat really was a hard lesson learned. Each sleepless night, every letter of demand from a lender, and every awkward dinner back at the parents' house became lessons in the process of surviving adversity. Simon, now, would look at the industry with an entirely fresh gaze. Not so much like a starry-eyed, starry-sky-stricken individual, but like a strategist bent on understanding the very framework of stardom. This kind of professional inquiry also raised issues never posed by anyone. What silences an audience? What makes them explode in applause? What have they remembered? Name, a face, a song? This was what he discovered to become the foundation of his empire. Brilliance was not a factor, nor was artistic merit or praise. It was simply a connection. Records were bought by the people, not the critics. Perfection held nothing to fame. It was the ability to resonate, to reach something raw and basic that made millions of strangers care. In losing everything, Simon had stumbled onto the formula that would one day rebuild him stronger: the rise of a ruthless visionary. From the ruins of bankruptcy, Simon Cowell did not disappear. He reinvented himself. What humiliation had taught him was invaluable. Critics did not buy records. The public did. If Fanfare's collapse stripped him of dignity, it also stripped him of illusions. From then on, he would not chase credibility. He would chase a connection. At BMG Records in the 1990s, Simon rebuilt his philosophy piece by piece. Gone were the grand dreams of timeless artists. Instead, he signed acts that insiders mocked, but the public adored. Pop duos like Robson and Jerome, boy bands like Westlife, and novelty singles that critics sneered at, but that soared to the top of the charts. Industry purists dismissed him as cheap. Journalists laughed, but his artists sold millions, and those sales gave Simon something more valuable than respect: leverage. And with that leverage, he sharpened his greatest weapon: his vision. Simon understood something most executives ignored. Music wasn't just sound, it was spectacle. It was about moments that ordinary people remembered, performances that made living rooms erupt, and personalities that sparked conversation long after the show ended. Before the dawn of the millennium, that philosophy erupted into something larger than mere music charts. Pop Idol was born in the UK in 2001. For the first time, Simon emerged from behind contracts and boardrooms to stand right in front of the very screens that beamed his persona into homes every day. Few believed he could ever survive in front of cameras. He was too blunt, too cold, too dismissive to charm audiences. Ironically, that bluntness became his greatest weapon. With his nasty comments, sharp wit, and intolerance for mediocrity, Simon became the most talked-about figure on television. Where others offered polite encouragement, Simon's comments pierced straight to the heart. Contestants sobbed, the audience gasped, and tabloids shrieked. What the critics deemed cruelty, the public embraced as truth. Audiences had grown weary of fake smiles and empty praise, and Simon was refreshingly honest. It stung. When American Idol began airing in 2002, Simon became more than just a record executive. He became a cultural force. The raised eyebrow, the brutal one-liners, and the ice silences, just as the performances were iconic, were all the rage. Not to hear aspiring singers sing their auditions, but millions tuned in specifically to hear Simon's verdict. He was no longer the boy who spent his time invisible in the mailroom or got his only income as a failed businessman living back at his parents' house. He was the judge most known in all of the world, and Simon knew precisely how to play it. That calculated cruelty was not careless. Every comment, every dismissal, every perfectly timed pause was part of a larger performance. He wasn't just judging the talent, he was shaping television into a brand new kind of spectacle. One where audiences felt like they were in the room beside him, deciding the fates of dreamers. By the mid-2000s, his empire had expanded worldwide through the X Factor and Got Talent franchises. At the peak of his glory, he had over 600 million viewers in over 100 countries watching formats stamped with Simon Cowell's name. His decisions could either build stars overnight or bring an end to a career before it started. Newspapers called him the most powerful man in television. But with power comes a price. His sharp tongue became not only a great asset, but also his worst enemy. He faced the public's booing and ridicule in tabloids and was painted as the villain of prime time. In later years, Simon admitted, "I knew people hated me, but I also knew I couldn't pretend to be someone I wasn't." That honesty had built his empire, but it had also isolated him. He sat like a king on a throne that, more often than not, felt like a prison. Simon had become television's most powerful figure, but his empire carried a price far heavier than ratings. Fatherhood and redemption. At the height of his power, Simon Cowell appeared untouchable. He was the face of primetime television, the man whose verdicts could make or break dreams, the mogul who commanded empires across continents. Yet, behind that glittering dominance, life was preparing a storm that no ratings victory could shield him from. In 2013, headlines erupted with a scandal that shook his carefully constructed world. News broke that Simon was expecting a child with Lauren Silverman, the wife of his close friend Andrew. It was not simply gossip, it was betrayal splashed across front pages. The tabloids devoured every detail, painting him not as the all-powerful judge, but as the judged. Overnight, the man who controlled countless careers lost control of his own narrative. The fallout was brutal. Andrew Silverman filed for divorce on grounds of adultery, friends distanced themselves, and Simon faced a firestorm of ridicule and condemnation. For a man who had built his empire on certainty and authority, the scandal was an open wound. In rare candor, he admitted, "It was not something I'm proud of." There were no excuses, no spin, only the heavy tone of regret. For some time, nothing loomed softly above the scandal. Projects were halted, critics ran amok, and Simon's very image seemed to be crumbling like that of an untouchable mogul. But in the midst of the disgrace came an undesired lifeline. Simon's son, Eric, was born in February 2014. For the cameras, it was just one star moment, with Simon Cowell holding his newborn. But for Simon, it was a metamorphosis. Eric was more than just a little life. Eric was hope. This ruthless mogul, who once starved for ratings and contracts, was now learning how to sing lullabies. The boardroom traded for bedtime stories and applause for soft coos. Fatherhood smoothened many sharp surfaces, and Simon, on confessing, said, "My priorities changed completely. My world suddenly wasn't about ratings or contracts. It was about him." Associates noticed it instantly. The man, once known for brutal critiques, now brightened with moving words about bedtime rituals, Lego towers, and family walks. Fatherhood saved him, was the remark of one eminent friend. Dark paths before this man were way along when he had not even hit headlines. Eric has given him the cause to stop, to heal, to begin again. Redemption, however, is never without its scars. The onslaught of scandal cost him friendships and trust, with a parting gift of guilt that no lullaby could quite erase completely. The public moved on, but no Simon, of course. Such mistakes, especially those made under the harshest spotlight, simply never disappear in some ways. Still, fatherhood reshaped him in ways no empire could. For a man once starved of affection in childhood, Eric's unconditional love filled a void that decades of success and wealth had failed to heal. The boy who once wept in silence at being unseen now found himself the most important person in someone else's universe. That paradox, a scandal that nearly destroyed him giving way to a love that saved him, became one of the most defining chapters of Simon Cowell's life. It marked the turning point from ruthless mogul to reflective father, from scandal-ridden celebrity to a man trying, in earnest, to rewrite his story. Out of disgrace came the one bond that would change Simon more than fame ever could: the cruel silence of loss. For all his success, Simon Cowell could never outrun the one truth that humbles even the most powerful: loss. In the glare of the spotlight, he appeared indestructible, a man armored in wealth, fame, and relentless ambition. But behind closed doors, he faced grief, that cut deeper than any criticism, leaving scars no contract or fortune could heal. In 1999, before his television empire, Simon's father, Eric Cowell, passed away. Eric had been strict, reserved, a man who measured love in discipline rather than words of affirmation. Yet, for Simon, his father remained the figure whose approval he had chased all his life. He often admitted the deepest wound of his childhood was hearing, "I'm proud of you," only in silence. When Eric died, Simon was just beginning to recover from bankruptcy, clawing his way back into music. The success he longed to share with his father never came in time. That unspoken pride became a ghost that would follow him for decades. A reminder that even triumph can feel empty if the person you long to impress is no longer there. 16 years later, grief struck again hard. This time it was for Simon's mother, Julie Brett, who passed away at the age of 89. Julie was a glamorous ballet dancer and socialite, but also Simon's anchor through a turbulent childhood. Her love at times was almost superficial. However, she was always there. Simon himself was in the thick of the X Factor when he received this news. From that moment on, nothing mattered to him. Not the cameras, contracts, nor contestants. Everything else was cancelled, and he withdrew from public appearances and into obscurity. Julie's departure from the world was, in the eyes of an outsider, the natural end of a long life. But for Simon, it became devastating. He softly shared, "Losing my mum was the hardest thing I've ever gone through." After the noise of the world, the silence that followed was deafening. The cheers of millions and the bright lights of studios could not fill that void left by the absence of the quiet woman who had always been there in the background from the beginning. Once more, the torment of his father's non-presence reopened with her death. The fact that Simon had lost both parents weighed heavily on him and created an even greater chasm of disconnection from his roots. Friends remembered him as terribly fragile in those months, a usually unshakable figure brought to quiet stillness. He had been left with the crushing realization that neither parent was there to witness him reap the full fruits of his empire. Ratings records, global franchises, fame that once seemed impossible. Yet something about Simon's grief that never came through at his success. It brought him to a halt. No thoughts about contracts, but thoughts about relationships. Understanding the fragility of time. Those closest to him registered a change. His edge softened, his patience deepened, and he would speak far more readily about family, presence, and those moments fame so often steals. Yet still, the echo of loss hung silent in the air. During these interviews, his voice would tremble in honor of his parents. The pain was not mere absence, but rather regret. Regret that he had spent years chasing after achievements while much more important times slipped through his fingers. It seemed cruelly ironic. The man who gave myriad young artists a chance to shine was now persecuted by the knowledge that his own parents never witnessed his most glorious times. For all his power, Simon was still just a son, haunted by the silence of parents who could no longer see him, the brutal price of mortality. By his 60s, Simon Cowell had already endured emotional wounds that few could survive. But fate had one more devastating lesson in store, the brutal reminder that even the most powerful are fragile when mortality strikes. It was August 2020, at his Malibu home, when curiosity turned to catastrophe. Testing a powerful new electric bike, Simon miscalculated for just 1 second. That second was enough. He was thrown violently to the ground, his back shattered in multiple places. In that instant, The man who had built an empire on unshakable control lost all of it. Later, he admitted chillingly, "I came within a minute of not making it." The injury was life-altering. 6 grueling hours of surgery followed. Steel rods were implanted into his spine. Every careless movement risked paralysis. For a man defined by sharp suits and upright posture, the irony was tragic. The titan of television, who once decided the fate of countless dreamers, was now confined to a hospital bed, unable to lift a glass of water without agony. Physically, the pain was relentless. The nights stretched into marathons of agony, punctuated only by doses of medication-induced sleep. Far more devastating than all was the thought of Eric, his son, who was but 6 and idolized his father. "I thought of Eric, and I knew I had to fight," Simon confessed, as he lay broken on the ground. This was no longer about ratings or contracts or empires. This was about bedtime stories, Lego castles, and the chance to hold his son again without wires, scars, or fear. Gradually, with much pain, Simon began to walk again. Every step was agonizing, yet a victory at the same time. Friends remembered him as so pale and thin, stripped of that great presence that once both terrified contestants and thrilled millions. Along with that pain was defiance, the same stubborn fire that had blasted him from mailroom clerk to global stardom. Just as he began to regain strength, tragedy struck again, another e-bike accident in early 2022. This time, he broke his arm and bruised his face. Even though it did not threaten his life as much as the shattered spine, the humiliation was merciless. Headlines once more vilified him for his recklessness, fragility, and foolishness. Once more, he donned a hospital gown, stitched and scarred. The greater injury had been psychological for Simon. To fall once was tragedy. To fall twice felt like punishment. The tale was clear. There was no real control. Control was always an illusion, the very thing upon which he had built the structure of his life. No empire, no worth, no fame could save him from an ugly blow from fate. Again it came, not a test of bones, but a test of vanity. Years of cosmetics and anti-aging procedures all began to give some distortion to the reflection. Botox, fillers, changes all justified by the glare of constant cameras had, slowly but steadily, stripped him of familiarity. The year 2021 dawned, and the fans just could not believe their eyes. The face looked frozen, the smirk was stiff, the features were strangely swollen. Headings screamed, "What happened to Simon Cowell's face?" The very man who made it, his life calling to judge appearances, saw himself judging, mocking, and ridiculing. The irony, he said, was horrible. He later confessed, "I went too far. At one point, I looked in the mirror and saw a man I didn't recognize." This was about much more than looks. For a man who had clawed from being invisible in childhood to being omnipresent on global screens, a sense of loss in staring back at himself in his own reflection felt akin to annihilation. What would ultimately arise from these scars, both physical and emotional, was utterly unexpected. Clarity. He would cease cosmetic procedures and let nature restore what needles had changed. Enough. Let it age. Let it show. It was an act of surrender. It was also an act of peace. Twice, fate had dragged Simon to the edge, reminding him that even legends can break in an instant. The man behind the mask. At 65, Simon Cowell is no longer the ruthless kingmaker who once ruled Saturday night television. Time has softened him, scars have reshaped him, and tragedy has forced him to reconsider what truly matters. Today, The man behind the mask of power is far more fragile, but also far more human. Each morning now begins not with phone calls to executives, but with slow, careful stretches prescribed by therapists. His back, still held together by steel rods from his 2020 accident, punishes him with stiffness every dawn. He eats by plan, not indulgence, low sodium to manage hypertension, antioxidants for energy, and light meals to ward off diabetes. The mogul, once fueled by adrenaline and ambition, is now fueled by discipline, each bite of food chosen as medicine rather than luxury. But perhaps the cruelest reminder of age is not his back, but his eyes. Years under harsh stage lights have dimmed his vision. Reading glasses are constant companions. Dim lighting leaves him squinting. For the man whose fortune was built on spotting brilliance in others, the thought of one day being unable to see his son Eric's face clearly terrifies him more than any tabloid headline ever could. And yet, it is Eric who has become the axis around which Simon's world now turns. Bike rides along the Malibu coast, fumbling piano lessons, bedtime stories read slowly but with love. These are his victories now. The ruthless judge, once defined by sharp critiques, now finds his sharpest joy in his son's laughter. It is a role no stage could script, no contract could replace. The empire still hums after all. There is a global franchise for Got Talent. The X Factor is enshrined in our cultural memory. A $600 million estimate of his fortune allows him to remain guarded in luxury. As for his cars, jets, and mansions, trophy possessions raised high in his ambitions, now gathering dust. He talks about them with an air of detachment, bordering at times on disdain. To Simon, wealth is no longer currency for measuring success. He will rather talk of what will outlive him. He has rewritten his will. Eric will not see the billions. Much of his fortune is destined for charitable causes, sponsor scholarships for disadvantaged youth, provide creative incubators for fledgling musicians, and set up health programs for children who start off with nothing. I don't want Eric to inherit money. I want him to inherit values, said Simon. This is not merely an act of cutting checks for Simon. It's his way of redefining what it means to create a legacy. His very countenance speaks the tale of surrender. The Botox injections and cosmetic surgeries that had once made his whole face stiff and unrecognizable are gone. He now proudly wears his age, his hair streaked with gray, and his face bears lines chiseled by years that have brought him triumph, tragedy, and survival. He was once acknowledged in an interview, "I've given up on chasing youth. I'd rather chase memories with Eric." There is something deep behind this acceptance. Gratitude. The man who once demanded perfection now understands fragility. The boy starved of affection became a mogul starved of peace. And the mogul, after falling, breaking, and grieving, finally came to the conclusion that peace does not come from applause or from the empire, but rather from presence, humility, and love. Those working with him today perceive the changes immediately. He speaks less about ratings and contracts, more about family and resilience. His verdicts are now guidance for the television audience. His wit has softened now into warmth. What was once viewed as a spectacle to witness his cruelty now finds the rare glimpse of empathy, a reminder that even the harshest judge is just a man scarred and struggling for meaning. This is perhaps the truest legacy of Simon Cowell. The stars he made, the empires he built, the millions that came his way. They are of no concern here. The concern here must lie with the man he has become after all that. Scarred but upright, flawed but genuine, gentler and smaller, but paradoxically stronger. And now, after everything Simon Cowell has endured at 65, do you think his story is truly tragic? Or is it a powerful lesson in resilience? Comment your thoughts below. I'd love to hear your take. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up, hit that subscribe button for more untold stories, and click on one of the 2 videos on your screen right now to keep watching.